I've been living in Washington State for a little over a year now, but I still remember my old life back in the South like it was yesterday. Sometimes, as I drive along these endless roads surrounded by towering evergreens and the smell of damp earth, I think about the humid summer nights of my hometown. There, the heat pressed against your skin like a thick blanket, and the air hummed with cicadas. You couldn't step outside without hearing someone calling your name from a porch across the street or a pickup passing by with its window rolled down, the driver always ready with a friendly wave or a quick comment on the weather. Back home, everything felt close-knit. The darkness, when it fell, was never absolute. Porch lights dotted every block, and the soft glow of street lamps made the shadows less intimidating. There was a sense of familiarity and safety I never recognized fully until I left. Now, up here in the Pacific Northwest, I've discovered a world of tall conifers, misty mornings, and quiet evenings that press in around you, leaving you feeling smaller and more isolated than you'd ever imagine. It's not that people here are unkind, they're just more reserved. They keep to themselves, nod politely instead of asking personal questions. It felt respectful at first, but after months of this, I realized how much I missed idle chatter and knowing my neighbors' first and last names, their family histories, their jokes, their sorrows. A year ago, not long after I moved, I took a job at a diner off a lonely stretch of highway. Back then, my finances were strained, and I needed steady work. The diner was a low, squat building with a chipped red roof, a rectangular neon sign that buzzed faintly in the evenings, and a gravel parking lot that got muddy whenever the rain fell. Inside, it was decorated in a style trying desperately to recall the 1950s, checkered floors, red vinyl booths, chrome accents, but it was tired, worn at the edges. The vinyl seats had tiny cracks, the menus were laminated but curling at the corners, and the jukebox in the corner seldom worked. Yet it had a certain charm. We served simple American fare: eggs, bacon, hash browns, pancakes, endless pots of coffee, and the kind of pie that's more sweet than subtle. The customers were mostly truckers passing through, a few long-haul drivers who knew the place as a decent pit stop. The official hours were unusual. We closed at 2 a.m., which was late for such a remote spot. Management insisted it was good for business, that it attracted travelers who might otherwise drive right by. In reality, it mostly attracted the desperate, the lost, and the occasional insomniac. By midnight, I was usually yawning and dreaming of my bed. We didn't have security guards or cameras with fancy night vision, just a grainy old CCTV system and a couple of locked doors. I had started as a morning waitress, but staff turnover and my willingness to pick up extra shifts landed me the late-night slot more often than not. It wasn't terrible. At first, I even enjoyed the quiet. Sometimes I'd have an hour or more between customers when I could wipe down counters, restock sugar packets, and listen to the distant hum of cars on the highway. Other times, I might get to know a trucker who'd tell me stories of the open road, or a local night owl who'd come in for pie. But as the weeks turned to months, I grew weary of the late hours. My body never fully adjusted to sleeping after the sun rose. And then, of course, there were the unsettling customers, the ones who gave me bad vibes. They were rare, but they existed, and one in particular would change how I saw everything. It was early spring, and the nights were still cold. Rain had been off and on all week, leaving puddles in the parking lot and a chill in the air. On the night it happened, I remember arriving at the diner around 6 p.m. I parked my old sedan out front and walked in, greeted by the smell of frying onions and stale coffee. The evening staff was finishing up. I'd be taking over with just Rick, our chef. Rick was a gruff older man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a face carved by decades of cigarette smoke and kitchen grease. He had a heart of gold beneath that scowl. Though, I liked Rick. He always made sure I had a fresh cup of coffee before starting my shift, and if I ever looked tired or hungry, he'd slide me an extra plate of fries or a warm biscuit fresh from the oven. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. A couple of truckers came in for burgers and coffee. A tired family of 4 who looked like they'd been driving all day stopped in for dinner. I made small talk, nothing too deep. Around 11 p.m., the customers thinned out. Midnight rolled around, and by that time the diner was usually empty or close to it. I spent some time cleaning the counters, refilling ketchup bottles, adjusting the radio that played softly in the background. Rick was in the kitchen, scrubbing the grill and organizing for closing. I felt that familiar anticipation of going home soon, crawling into bed and resting my aching feet. As the clock edged toward 2 a.m., I checked the time and started mentally going through my closing routine. I'd wipe the last counter, count the register, lock the door, and be on my way in about 15 minutes. Rick popped his head out from the kitchen and gave me a nod. Everything felt routine, almost cozy in its familiarity. The night outside was unusually still. No wind, no rain, just darkness pressing against the windows. And then, about 10 minutes before closing, the door jingled and a man walked in. I looked up, forcing a polite smile. He was heavy-set, maybe in his late 40s, with jeans that rode a bit too high, a brown, somewhat outdated jacket, and a tucked-in gray shirt. His mustache was the kind that reminded me of old TV shows, and he wore large, slightly tinted glasses that reflected the diner's fluorescent lights. He smiled, but something about his expression made me uneasy. There was a stiffness, as if he were performing rather than genuinely smiling. I greeted him with my standard line, "Hi there, just one tonight?" And he said yes, just one. I guided him to a booth. Although we were near closing, I had to remain courteous. "Just so you know, our kitchen closes in about 10 minutes, I said gently. He nodded, still smiling. "That's fine," he said, introducing himself as Nolan. I'd never had a customer volunteer their name so openly, especially at this hour. I filed that away in my mind as slightly odd, but not alarming yet. People can be quirky. Nolan glanced at the menu, barely taking a moment before saying he wanted black coffee and French toast. A simple order. Thankfully, I went back and told Rick, who grimaced but started prepping anyway. I returned with the coffee and set it down in front of Nolan. He thanked me, that odd smile never wavering. Instead of looking at his phone or out the window, he looked at me. "So, are you from around here?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. It wasn't unusual for customers to ask where I was from. I had a slight southern accent that lingered even after a year in Washington. Usually I'd say something vague like, "not too far," or mention I'd moved up here recently. That night, I was more cautious. The diner's isolation, the late hour, and the man's strange vibe made me careful. I said something noncommittal. I'm local enough, and tried to steer the conversation towards something neutral, like the weather. But Nolan persisted. He complained about the roads, too many potholes, not enough decent signage. I offered a small smile and explained that the winters here cause lots of road damage. He leaned forward slightly, asking again if I was born here or if I'd just moved recently. I lied and said I'd been around for a while. I never gave out personal details, especially late at night. Back home, I might have been more open, but I'd learned to be guarded. Something about his eyes behind those glasses seemed too curious, too calculating. After a few more minutes, Rick emerged from the kitchen with a plate of French toast. He raised an eyebrow at me, as if asking silently, "What's this guy's deal?" I just shrugged slightly. Nolan thanked Rick and started eating slowly, cutting each piece meticulously. I pretended to be busy wiping down the counter, organizing sugar packets, anything to avoid returning to that booth. Nolan's presence was unsettling. I dealt with flirts, drunks, and weirdos before, but there was a controlled intensity in this man that set my nerves on edge. Eventually, he finished his meal. I wasted no time bringing the check. I didn't say, "Take your time." Instead, I said, "Here you go," trying to convey that we were closing. Nolan paid by card, left a surprisingly generous tip, and stood up. He lingered, looking at the empty diner, then at me. I forced another polite smile and said, "Have a good night." He responded in a warm tone that felt fake. "You too, Kathy." He'd seen my name tag, of course, but the way he said my name was unsettling, like he was testing it out. I watched him leave, relief washing over me as the door shut behind him. Rick and I finished closing tasks quickly. Rick was the one to lock up the kitchen. After I cleaned Nolan's table and grabbed my belongings, I waved goodbye to Rick and stepped out into the cool night. The parking lot was still and quiet under a sky dotted with faint stars. I noticed that aside from my sedan and Rick's old truck, there was another car parked farther away. It looked older, maybe a dull silver Toyota or something similar, and I couldn't see the interior. I assumed it must have been Nolan's. Odd that he hadn't parked closer, but maybe he preferred a quick exit route. Trying not to overthink it, I got into my car. The drive home would be about 20 minutes along a mostly empty highway flanked by dense forests. Over the past year, I'd grown accustomed to these drives. I'd learned to appreciate the silhouettes of the evergreens against the night sky, the way headlights carved through darkness. But tonight, I felt uneasy. I told myself it was just Nolan's strange vibe lingering in my mind. I turned on some soft music and rolled down the window a crack to let in fresh air. 10 minutes into my drive, my dashboard dinged. A warning light, low tire pressure. My heart sank. I'd never had to deal with a flat tire alone at 1 a.m, on a deserted highway. I watched the pressure in my rear passenger tire drop rapidly, 20 psi, 1510. Soon, the car began to shake alarmingly. I had no choice but to pull over. My palms were clammy as I guided the car onto the shoulder. Stepping outside, I could see the tire was flat as a pancake.
Great.
I sighed and looked around. No lights, no houses, just trees and darkness. The only sound was my engine ticking as it cooled. I had roadside assistance through my insurance, I thought, but I'd never called them before. I fumbled with my phone, trying to find the number. That's when headlights appeared behind me, growing brighter as a car slowed down. Relief battled with fear in my chest. Help or danger. I rushed back inside my car and locked the doors. The car behind me stopped, and I saw someone approach. A gentle tap on my window. I turned and froze. It was Nolan. He stood there smiling, now wearing a pair of gloves, like leather driving gloves. My stomach twisted. He acted surprised to see me. "Kathy, is that you? You okay?" he said through the glass, as if this was a delightful coincidence. I cracked the window barely an inch. I told him I had a flat tire. He feigned ignorance, asked which one, circled around the car as if inspecting. Inside, I was panicking. What were the odds that the same man from the diner would show up on this empty road, just after I got a flat? This was no coincidence.
He must have followed me.
Maybe he slashed my tire back at the diner. My heart pounded in my ears. I dialed 911 as discreetly as possible, placing the phone on my lap. Nolan came back to my window, offering to change the tire for me. He insisted he knew what he was doing. I forced a laugh and said my boyfriend was on his way. I tried to speak in a way that the 911 operator could understand my predicament without Nolan catching on. I mentioned I was on a certain highway, waiting for my boyfriend, unsure how the tire went flat. Nolan's expression darkened when I said boyfriend. He stood there, staring at me for a tense moment. Then he stepped away. Seizing the moment, I whispered into the phone, telling the operator that a man had slashed my tire and I was scared. I gave the closest landmark I could think of, desperately hoping the police could triangulate my location from the call. Suddenly, a sharp, explosive sound shattered my thoughts. The driver's side window burst inward, spraying me with glass. I screamed, pure terror pouring out of my lungs. Nolan reached in, grabbing for my phone. I yelled that I was on the phone with the police, begged him to stop. My mind was racing. I expected him to try to drag me out, choke me, something horrible. Instead, he snatched my phone and hurled it out into the darkness, sending it skittering across the pavement. I sobbed, clutching the steering wheel, feeling powerless. Then, inexplicably, he retreated. I heard his footsteps hurry back to his car, heard the engine rev, and saw his taillights disappear down a side road. Silence fell, broken only by my ragged breathing. The wind rustled through the trees. I was alone, no phone, a shattered window, a flat tire, and no guarantee Nolan was gone for good. The minutes dragged. Every distant sound could have been him returning. I considered trying to drive on the rim, but that would risk damaging the car or leaving me stranded somewhere even worse. So I waited, praying the 911 operator had understood enough to send help. It felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes before I saw the telltale flash of blue and red lights. Police sirens wailed softly, then grew louder. I stumbled out of my car, waving my arms to guide them. 2 patrol cars pulled up and officers emerged, hands near their holsters, scanning the area. I babbled my story, tears streaming down my face. The diner, the strange man named Nolan, the flat tire, the smashed window, him taking my phone. The officers listened calmly, one of them retrieving a flashlight to search for my phone. It was found, screen cracked, useless now. They were kind. They asked me for a description of Nolan, his clothes, his face, the make of his car. I did my best, voice trembling. One officer radioed in the details, and another took pictures of my car and the broken glass. They changed my tire right there on the shoulder, something I never expected from police, but I was grateful beyond words. Then they offered me an escort home, which I eagerly accepted. The drive home was surreal, following a police cruiser with my heart still pounding. I couldn't stop imagining Nolan's face illuminated by my dome light, that forced smile, those gloves. When I reached my apartment, the police waited until I was safely inside before leaving. I didn't sleep that night. My body trembled with aftershocks of fear. I kept replaying the events, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't called 911, if I hadn't insisted I had a boyfriend coming, if I'd lowered the window more than an inch. A week later, the lead officer called me. They'd reviewed the diner's security footage. Nolan was on it, of course, but it didn't help much. His car's plates weren't visible, and it was too dark to ID him clearly. They had no leads. My stomach churned at the thought that he might still be out there, free to try this again with someone else. I told the officer I was terrified to return to work. He understood. He didn't tell me what to do, but he said, "Your safety comes first." I thanked him and hung up, tears stinging my eyes. I quit the diner job the next day, leaving a voicemail for the manager that I wouldn't be returning. I didn't mention the details, just that I had to move on. And I did move on, in a way. I packed up what little I had in Washington and decided to go back south, closer to my family. They never fully understood why I left in the first place, but when I came back, they could see something had changed in me, an edge of caution I hadn't carried before. To this day, when I drive alone at night, I find myself checking the rearview mirror more often than I should, scanning the darkness for headlights that linger too long. I get jumpy if a car follows me through too many turns. I keep my phone charged, my doors locked, and I've learned how to change a tire by myself in daylight, just in case. The memory of Nolan's face still haunts me, that unsettling smile, and the sound of glass shattering beside my ear. It taught me how fragile our sense of safety can be, especially when we're alone in unfamiliar places. Predators don't always fit the Hollywood stereotype. They can be well-dressed or polite at first, slipping into your life when you least expect it. And sometimes they show up at the worst possible moment, like a flat tire on a deserted road. I survived that night thanks to a mixture of luck, quick thinking, and the prompt arrival of the police. But not everyone is so fortunate. Whenever I think about that night, I remind myself that trust is something to be earned carefully, that isolation can breed danger, and that my instincts are worth listening to, no matter how polite society expects me to be. I tell myself that he's long gone, that maybe they caught him eventually for something else, or maybe he moved on. But the truth is, I don't know. All I know is that I'll never forget the chill of that empty highway, the shattering glass, and the knowledge that in that moment, I was inches away from becoming a statistic. And so I hold tight to the lessons I learned, driving a little more carefully, watching a little more closely, and never again taking the quiet darkness of a lonely road for granted.